with any luck, this will be a nice, fun, quick and recorded intro to business strategy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th and final for the summer workshop from the Ideation Clinic for the Praxis Spinal Cord Injury Institute Challenge. I want to thank you for coming today. We have quite an interesting plan. It really, at least this is my favorite part. And I'm hoping to do a little quick workshop with you at the end that I think will be a lot of fun. And depending on the number of people joining us, we will either break up into smaller work teams and then come back and share our ideas, or we will do it as a group together. But really today, we are talking about implementation. So you had your big idea, you've managed to put it into some kind of expression, a prototype. You've now shown the prototype around, you're pretty happy with it. What else do you do? What do you do next? This is the stuff outside, starting to go outside of the university or research experience, more into small business innovation. How do you go the next step? So this is knowledge mobilization or just fun. So Chris, may I ask you to help with the land acknowledgement statement?
Sure thing, Joseph. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land.
Thank you.
Since this is a virtual meeting, you could do the same wherever you are.
Because all of Canada was someone else's. So thank you again for joining. I would like to extend a welcome to those of us joining us again. We have some discussion points and developments that we will talk about in terms of the Praxis Challenge after our workshop. For now, we are going to talk about business models, business strategy, and I very much would appreciate, if possible, those of you that are joining us to turn on your cameras so that we're relative, if you can. If you have bandwidth limitations or other limitations, feel free not to, but those of you that can, it would be great to see who I'm talking to and with. My goal today actually is to make this very conversational. I've had a number of years of experience around these, so I want to show you what we're doing that's a little different and how, but I also want to, along the way, talk about the strategies themselves, tips and tricks and things that I've discovered that may or may not be relevant for all of you. So the goal today is to go, and I want to show you how we've organized for future iterations, the curriculum within the context of the problem solving and ideation space. And so I think we should get started. I'm actually quite looking forward to this. So what I want to do is actually show you how to think about your business or going into business. And it is actually going to be very, very oversimplified unless you push it and talk with me and ask specific questions. But essentially, we're going to cover things like licensing, business models, intellectual property, research and development, regulatory strategies, and where do you beg for money? At the end of the day, all of those things are very important in getting whatever your idea is out to people that will buy it. So you have a minimal viable product. You started out with a kind of idea, and those of you that have been with us may have seen how we sort of touched in the workshop number 1 around the ideation key, looking at how do we develop our ideas into concepts, and we go around this framework, and then concepts become proof of concepts. Is it feasible? Is this thing in my head actually something that I can do or can be done in this particular space? Then all of a sudden, your lab, and I use this very loosely, lab could be your garage lab where you're putting stuff together, versus an actual lab with fume hoods, et cetera, and everything in between. So you've developed something and you've prototyped it, you've shown that it works. And now what? Well, this is the fun part, and we could talk a little bit about business model antecedents and business model selection and implementation and all of the various things, but it's actually not that difficult, or it doesn't have to be. Maybe iteratively you can get to those stages and formalize it, and there are some really brilliant MBAs that can put it into really, really important business speech, and that is very important. I'm not trying to downplay the need when you are ready to seek investments to have your documents and things in the appropriate language. But when you are getting started, this is the quick and dirty way. Really, the whole thing is about this. Know your customer, the person that you're going to be trying to help and / payee. This is something that's unique. We'll talk a little bit about it in terms of healthcare. Know your exit and then work backwards. So think about it this way. What is an exit? What's your plan? And it seems kind of silly, but when you know what you plan to do with your idea, innovation, venture from the beginning, it can help you make much better choices along the way. And so if your exit is to be in a viable, sustainable business that helps you pay your rent and your food bills, and it is going to be going on and on from day to day, then that's great. You will build towards that. If your exit is to build a company or an idea, or not even build an idea, but to sell off the idea to someone else, that's perfectly fine too. Or give it away, but you need to think about how you're going to do that. And everything in between, to the 1 in a million shot, you're going to go and create an IPO and offer it to people, and the public offering does so well that you can come back and fund all of these workshops in the future. So, are there any questions, comments before we get right into it? Seeing none. So on the screen, you have on the right 9 points that I'm going to quickly cover in the next 20 minutes or so, hopefully, unless we get talking. Those 9 points are essentially your strategy for implementing your idea. It's pretty common. Other places, other things use the same words. You can use the lean business startup model canvas. There are a number of resources online. There are a number of resources locally and in your area, I'm sure, about specifics of setting up a business plan, and it can be 40 pages, 80 pages, depending on your needs. But the basics are essentially more or less these 9 things. So the first thing, and absolutely most important, is to know your customer. That word is really problematic because it can be, in the traditional sense, your customer, but if you are delivering a healthcare related service or intervention, your customer, it can be a lot of different things. The person who gets the service may not be the one who requests it. It could be a family member, it could be a physician. The person that requests it may not be the person that's using it, which may not be the person that actually is paying for it, which may not be the person that is approving it. So in health-related businesses, it is really important to first start to know who your customer is, but also who pays the bill, who issues the prescription or the recommendation, and everything in between. And the key that you really want to know, especially about whoever the person who is going to be the beneficiary of your intervention, is what is their unmet need? Beyond everything, this is one of the ideologies that both the Praxis Institute, when we first started talking about this challenge, is that we're very much in line with. Know the person you are going to be helping. Know the person that will in the end benefit from your good service, product, intervention. They are your absolute most important person, stakeholder. They are the ones that have the need that you're trying to address. At the end of the day, and I'm just going to put it in the context of, let's say, a clinic or a hospital. In the end of the day, at the hospital, if you do a treatment that patients absolutely hate, that you can't really convince them of or justify in some way, even if the justification is there's nothing better, but if you can't get them on board, it's very hard to keep that service or good going. So then identifying and testing and talking to people right up front solves a lot of your problems, as you will see. And so the other thing I'm trying to do here is I'm also mapping these points to the ideation key framework that we've talked about in the past to show you how it can also be used as a round to build your business strategy. So after you have identified the key stakeholders, the next logical step is to figure out, I know who the people are, what's causing this? What's creating this need of theirs? So this actually is something that's fairly common. You can think about it in terms of categories. One reason is going to be economic. Whatever the need is, it may be caused because the other intervention, solution, whatever you want to call it, that already exists on the market is very expensive. The need could also exist because there are regulatory issues that the product or the service needs to meet. And so it could be that the way they're meeting it or the cost of meeting the regulatory hurdles is so high that there isn't a lot of other people trying and you're stuck with their product. So in those cases, if you can make a better one that meets the needs, huge opportunity. Another sort of common issue is technology. And the other one is personal preference. It's really, the problem is going to be an economic one, a social, political one, a technological one, cultural, individual. So once you identify what that problem is and go in and you verify it to make sure that you understand it well, you then have to decide on your product or service. And once you're looking at your solution or your idea, the question is, what is it? So you're going to have to describe your idea in some way. And most important, does it meet your customer's need or your beneficiary's need? Until you verify that, that's your value. So when you're writing a value statement, for example, and a lot of places, even sort of contests now will ask for, well, what's your value proposition? And not just for profit or commercialization based, it actually, even in projects in hospitals and other places, what value does your work, does this bring to us? And quite often your answer should be that it meets a particular need that people have and how it meets it. It's that's the value. All right. Are there any questions? All of these are just elements of essentially that goes on to be a kind of mini business plan or one pager. The next element is your team. So who's on your team? Who are the right people to help you? If you are doing an engineering problem, but you don't have somebody on your team who is capable of engineering or talking to engineers or working with engineers or hiring engineers, it's going to be an issue. The next thing you need to think about is, how is your team structured? So sole proprietorship, limited partnership, corporation, this is incorporation. Does anyone out there what are the advantages of some of these and disadvantages? Is anyone out there a sole proprietor?
Well, I not as it relates to the product right now, but I know like some of the, just to your previous question, advantages and disadvantages. I believe there's like a liability issue. So like if you're a corporation, you're kind of absolving yourself to some degree of liability if something goes on. But the disadvantage is that you have to also spend a lot of money filing tax returns and doing financial statements. So it could be quite expensive if you're not bringing in any revenue.
Absolutely. So that's awesome. So in another context, I've had this conversation that this is very gendered, actually. Women tend not to incorporate as often as men. I think it's something like 20% or 18%, whereas men tend to incorporate about 63% of their ventures. The central benefits across most jurisdictions, but it varies, are exactly as Sharon outlined. Number one is, when you incorporate, you limit your personal liability. So in some countries or jurisdictions, you will limit it to a certain amount. In Canada, for example, as somebody who becomes an officer of a company that's been incorporated, you are liable for payroll, tax deductions, and payroll up to certain amounts. And last time I looked, which was a long time ago, something like $50,000 for these. But if you look it up, that's one of your main liabilities as an officer of a company. However, there are also really good advantages. Number one, first and foremost, is that the tax rates on corporations universally tend to be lower than individual taxes. So if you run a limited, an incorporated company, even if you're an individual and you're making a lot of money, there are benefits to having the corporation in terms of a much lower tax rate, about 20% versus 50% or higher sometimes, or depending on the country, it may be lower. But there's a lot of advantage from the corporate perspective, because if you're able to have that income and spend it on things, in today's world, you'd have to check an accountant, so don't quote me, but things like, I would imagine during COVID, a portion of your house can be written off. So that comes out of the business portion, which is taxed much lower than your personal income tax if it was all to go to you. So there are actually good reasons, and you should really talk to somebody, both someone who knows their tax code and somebody who knows the legal aspects of incorporation. So how you structure your team is important, because if you're delivering, for example, a really something that has a lot of implications, that someone could hurt somebody, that has, you know, a lot of litigious issues around it, especially in the States, the last thing you would want to be is on everything on your name and without having any kind of insulation. So especially with health related products, there's a lot of potential for liability. The next kind of stage that you need to think about as you're going to be implementing something and as you're designing your business is, what resources do you have and how will you use them? In particular, amongst the various things, you need to think about intellectual property. This needs to be done at the very beginning, not at the end. And how you decide to position your intellectual property has huge implications. So I don't want to go too deep into it, but I can if there are people out there that want to talk about these things. The basic things you need to think about, though, or the basic ways to protect your ideas are involve patents. If it's an expression of idea, if it's a creative art, it's called a copyright. Something that's creative is actually, in many ways, easier to knock off, but also easier to protect, because the old-fashioned cheap way of protecting your ideas is to print a physical copy and email it to yourself in a sealed envelope with the date stamp. And you have proof that you came up with that particular idea in a particular time. Nowadays, with the internet and date stamping and encryption and storage, there are many other ways to sort of document that you have a particular idea. That's sort of the copyright. The patenting is a little different, because the patenting, you can start in Canada and the US with a provisional patent as soon as you have something that you think might have value. provisional patents essentially are a bookmark that give you about a year to file the real patent. So if you want to go talk about it and you have a patent pending, you have at least a bookmark that will go back to that date of filing, which then allows you some freedom to talk about or share your idea. The issue, though, is that other countries do not have patent pending. So once it's public in a year's time in Canada and the US, it also is now searchable in the EU potentially, although patent pending is a little different, but you have, you just have to think about the timing of how you file in which country. And it's kind of, patents can get very expensive. So provisional patent will start at, if you do it sort of on the real cheap, you can do a filing as cheap as about 500 US. A lawyer or patent agent will cost you more. You're looking closer to $2,000 plus. And that's for the provisional. A full patent can run, depending on the costs but you're looking at 10,000 plus potentially. Again, depending on the lawyer, there's some lawyers that can do things on the cheap. That's not necessarily a good thing. And then finally, if you want to file an international patent, those can run 100,000 plus easily, depending on the jurisdictions. So understanding this, the landscape of going to market is really important, and it's worth reading about and investing into, because the other way of doing it, and this is what a lot of people in academia sometimes don't realize, is that I hear a lot from people, oh, you know, I need my patent, my IP, the university or the hospital or this, they own it. I can't do anything about it. It's not fair. I'm not going to work in the hospital and give away my IP. They're going to own 75% of it and I only have 25. Oh. Well, the reality actually is, and here's the thing, it's not the IP that's owning it that's the most important. It can be about licensing it. Do you really care if your institution that pays your patenting fees owns 75% of the IP if they license it to your company for 1% of net profits? It's the really important thing is in the licensing negotiations and how you use those licenses. The other way of sort of is trade secrets. Do the Coca-Cola thing. As you go to market and you're thinking about your resources, the next thing you need to really plan in terms of implementing something is regulatory strategy. Now, this may or may not apply. If you are outside of a hospital and you're selling to people in homes, you may not need to be considered as a medical device or a pharmaceutical, but you need to check and you need to know, and there are people in regulatory spaces that know a lot of the ins and outs of this. Are there any questions before I keep going? Yes.
I just have a question about the licensing. So do you mean like you're creating a product and you're allowing people to use it for a fee? Is that what you mean by licensing, basically? Okay, and it's like a time limit, like just like when we download software from U of T, we get the license to do it for a year, but we paid for it, kind of thing?
That's actually different. So when you do, that's actually a subscription fee model for a license. So it's like a purchase. What I mean by licensing is quite often, if it's not your own invention or you are the inventor, which is different than the PI or researcher, but let's say you are listed as the inventor on a patent that your hospital has filed for you. Most likely, depending on whatever is set in your employee contract, the hospital or your employer will own a portion of that. Those portions can, in favorable work environments, be very low. In hospital environments, they can be 50%. In the past, at sick kids, they've been 75%. So that means that as a person that developed an idea, the hospital will own 75% of the patent. What that means is, although you have a say in what happens to that patent, the inventor actually has a very small say, 25%, which generally can easily be overruled by the 75%. However, the way that institutions make money on these patents, generally, because many of them don't actually do the work themselves. Like a hospital may not desire to go out and make a new kind of bed, but they may be willing to take their patent from the researcher and say, hey, bed company, you want to use this patent? We're going to give you permission, the rights to this patent under these conditions. And so you write up a license. Licenses can be very, very, very specific. So you are allowed to use this patent, this widget, in this country on every other day of the week. And I'm not kidding. There are things in other countries that you can only use every other day of the week. So they can be jurisdictional. They can be very broken and cut up in different ways. It's usually the institution's advantage not to give you what's the golden grail of all go-to-market strategies, 100% complete license to any use under the sun. They want to make more money, so they will break it up, usually, depending. If there's a lot of value, they'll sell a piece to one company that will work here, another piece to another company that will implement it in this way. So that is a strategy, actually. So even if you don't own 75% of the patent, if you can turn around to the tech transfer office and say, hey, I'm the PI, I have a stake in this, I want to commercialize this, and I'd like a license that's no money up front. If and when I start making money and profits in my company, which is of course going to be incorporated, I'll pay you 1% royalties. In which case, from that perspective, do you care that the hospital owns 75% of the patent? No, because the fact is they will only monetize on the patent if you and your company start making amazing amounts of money. Okay. Does that sort of answer your question, Sharon?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So that was sort of thinking about intellectual property and licensing. Regulatory is also a strategy. For example, let me give a pharmaceutical example. In pharmaceuticals, when you go to the FDA, and Health Canada is very similar, and you say, hey, I have this drug that I've developed for this use, and you are very, very, very clear on the use of the medication. So those claims that you make going through regulatory are very strategic, because you say my drug will only work on headaches. You know it works on other things potentially, but it works best on headaches. So when you go through the trials and show the FDA efficacy, then you are only subject and evaluated on whether or not it works for headaches, whether your claim, your one claim, is appropriate. If it is, then you get a patent or the right to use that intellectual property for a certain period of time, and you're happy. And you start moving forward, and then you sell into the market, you make your money, and the patent passes 20 years. Well, if you're a rich and forward-thinking pharmaceutical company, you say, aha, sure, it works on headaches, but now I'm going to go and patent it for general body aches. And then you make the claim and you test and you provide the evidence that, yes, sure enough, this drug can be repurposed for body aches. And you now can sell that same drug for body aches for the next 20 years. So it's a strategy. Once you've sort of thought about those things, then you have to think about, where do you fit into the market, the context. So where is your market? Who are your competitors? How are you different or the same as your competitors? This will talk about your value and how you deliver your value. So if the value meets an unmet need, how you deliver it. It could be, you know, right now care can be done face-to-face, which costs X number of dollars, or from here on in, you are virtual, so it costs you significantly less and you charge less. So positioning how you deliver your product, your channels, is very important. And then how will you get out there? It's fine if you have a product on a shelf somewhere, but unless someone actually takes it down and pays for it, you actually haven't sold anything. You haven't, well, in health, I mean, technically you could have sold something, but you haven't helped anybody. Let's go there. So understanding where you fit into the supply chain and all the various models is important. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going pretty fast. I hope that this is sort of giving you a real quick overview. If people feel that's okay, I can see 4 or 5 faces. Thumbs up would be good. We should have a rating system. Thumbs down if you want me to go to something else. That's the thing. This is the new form of education, by vote. Okay. The next thing that you have to think about in these 9 points is your revenue. And I'm not talking necessarily about I'm going to rip out somebody's throat and sell something that's worth 50 cents for $150 because it's in a country where there are no laws against that sort of thing, and that's it. No, I'm talking about something as simple as, how do you make sure when you do something or produce something or provide a service that you can do it again? For example, I once knew a social entrepreneur who set up a company packaging things and employed recently released convicts. So there was a subsidy from the government, but she made a money in the packaging for companies, and was able to give a second chance to people. And so, and she wasn't interested in being a billionaire. Maybe she was just content with being able to pay all of her employees and herself and a couple core staff. So how you're going to make revenue is really important. If Ontario government or a provincial government is paying for it through reimbursements, you have to know how you're going to get those things reimbursed, how you're going to make those claims. If it's not a government agency and it's a corporation, maybe you need POs purchase orders from them to document. If it's with a hospital, you will need to talk to a procurement person and find out their ways of paying and who and how. And this is important because in today's market, you can actually make money by giving stuff away. Giving away access or education or something that people want in return for future purchases of that education, the freemium model, is something that can potentially make a lot of money for people. So finally, when you're thinking about implementing something, you will need to sort of have a plan. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next? And these become your milestones that mark your progress. And generally, no matter what you do, milestones are not just good for you and your team and meeting deadlines. They're also very good for selling your ideas and showing people you're serious about deliverables. Because if you are going for a grant, you will have to show them certain milestones and report on them. If you are getting money from an investor, you will most likely be judged on how you set out those milestones and whether or not you meet them. As you grow and you get more investment or different kinds of things, they're increasingly, milestones make a big difference in terms of achievement. This is the biggie. So you got your idea. How are you going to fund it? And very few of us are like Bill Gates or Elon Musk, that can decide we want to have a little rocket ship to play with, and suddenly there's a rocket ship. Most of us will, at some point, if we are trying to commercialize our ideas, depend on external sources of funding. And this is just really a broad overview, but usually investors want people, or the tradition is, depending on who you are, you spend a little bit of your money or you get a little bit of stuff from your lab. I've had supervisors that would give a student a corner of a desk, and they would work off that desk corner until they could establish things and find other sources of income, either initially grants. So in Canada, the government provides a number of grants that help you, like I2I, which is level in engineering. There are several levels of idea to innovation grants that help you develop concepts into commercializable products. After that, and this is sort of part of this valley of death, the initial valley of death between an idea and its expression and actually going into a sustainable business model. There likely are angels, or what's called friends and family. And so in healthcare, it's a little bit harder in this stage, because I've seen cases where someone really believes in their product, and this actually happened, and had their mother invest in them. And then in 2 years, the mother is, where's my money? It wasn't a lot, but I expect it back. And the individual was still developing the trials, to the evidence to sort of come forward with this. And this resulted in a series of constant discussions. And so the thing with healthcare is that the road, or health in general, because of the ethical and regulatory and complexities, as well as the who pays, how do you make money, where do you make money, what jurisdiction, because of all of those complexities, the pathway to market, the runway tends to be significantly longer than a 6-month app, for example. If you are spending, so Mike Timiansky, who runs No Inc., incorporated in 1999, I believe, is working on round 3B clinical trials before they can release their product. So 1999 and it's 2021. He had to have his patent extended because it went past the 20 years. So the pathway is hard. Once you start breaking even, once somebody actually buys your product, and that's really important, that's a huge milestone, because I had a story of one individual that very successful in business now, but during their first business venture, they came up to a bunch of doctors standing around who were all their friends and asked, "What do you think of this?" And all the doctors loved it and praised it. Once it was actually produced, nobody bought it because the doctors were being nice to their friend, and they weren't going to actually buy it. So be careful until somebody puts in some money and buys your product. That's a big deal. Once you start doing that, then you can really leverage other kinds of income. And depending on your strategy, your exit strategy, if you want to stay a small business, you may be entitled to apply for bank loans and different kinds of assistance to grow your business. In Canada, we're very fortunate. We have a number of mechanisms to do that. Or you might be applying for funding from either preclinical trials, funding from serious angels or low-end VCs, or you may be applying for Series A funding, which is in the millions of dollars to really ramp up what you're doing, and everything in between. In order to do that, though, you need to know your exit strategy, what your plan is, and how will you get there. So what's your timeline? So if I need, for example, to ramp up to full speed in 5 years, then how much money per year will be needed to execute the project? At what phase? If I am going to be employing 20 people, what are their salaries going to be, and work backwards? If I need space, what kind of financing will the space require over the 5 years? And you just put in all your expenses as much as possible and your projected revenue, and you make yourself a budget in terms of figuring out how much to even ask for. It's really, if you know, or you think you need $50,000 to get your project off the ground, but in reality, it takes you $250,000, and somebody with experience can sort of guess that, the more accurate you appear, the more you have done your homework, the better off you are in terms of impressing potential funders. All right. So, any questions? Shall we take a break? I don't even have the time. Oh my God, an hour is gone. Shall we take a quick break? I want, after questions, yes. If you need a break, why don't you go take it during this question discussion thing period. Please do stick around because I have kind of a fun thing to do now that we're done. Go ahead.
Hello, and thanks for your great education. how can we find out that how much budget do our business or idea need? What are the ways?
Well, so it really depends where you're at with your project. There are people, for example, that do this for a living, and they will evaluate what you're trying to do, ask you a bunch of questions, and help you with projections that can be very accurate and can be very, very nuanced. If, on the other hand, you're sort of starting and you're at the beginning of your project, you need to think of what are your basic expenses over a period of time. So if you want to start manufacturing something, how much will it cost you to produce approximately a unit of that? How much will you be paying people for the materials? Who do you need to have in your organization to do that? So the bigger, the more ambitious, the more employees you might need, unless you're, doing something completely digital. And so you just take it one step at a time, and then you develop sort of at full capacity. Imagine in 5 years, I would like to run a company with 20 employees who are going to be paid a living wage. Some of them will have this type of benefits, so I need this. So then approximately you need X number of dollars per employee times 20. And you stage it, you go back a year, now you don't have 20 employees, you only have 10. And you go back another year, and you need 5. But now you're operating on 5 for 3 years from now until 3 years from now, and then you'll grow again. So that's how you sort of do it. There are actually a lot of resources you can look up where it'll talk about planning a budget for this type of business. So, and that's where we are getting back to implementation and full circle back in terms of how do you implement and how do you grow beyond an idea or a prototype. You start putting together a plan. All a business really is a plan on how you're going to execute your project, what resources you'll need, and where you'll get them.
Thank you.
I hope that was useful.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
All right. Go ahead. Oh, anyone else with a question? Does anyone? Okay. Okay, so we're a pretty small group. So those that sort of would participate, I encourage you to turn on your cameras and your microphones. And I'm going to guide this, but hopefully stay quiet. I apologize, I haven't been able to read the posts in the chat. Okay, so here's what I propose we do for the next fun 30 minutes. I hope that was fun. I hope you see how it's like a big puzzle, and putting it together and figuring out what the shape and the pieces look like is how you start shaping your idea. So, no better way to think about it than to actually have a quick case study. So let's do this together. And please, for this to be useful, don't let me do all the talking. So you see, here's the thing. All of us, we are part of a group, part of a lab that have been working together on a project. And it just so happens that as of 4 days ago, we learned that MIT scooped us. MIT has patented exactly the idea that we had. Because as part of the Ideation clinic, we were thinking of doing something to deal with pressure ulcers. And in doing so, we realized that we would need a material that was sensitive and that could change shape in order to reduce pressure on particular parts of the body. And we are going to make not necessarily clothing out of it, but mattresses, cushions, seat covers, lots of things, so that when a body temperature reaches a particular threshold in particular areas, the material will change shape. This was published in Nature Communication, I believe, on June 3rd, 2021. So you have identified a strong unmet need, prevention of pressure sores. And you've gone around and you've talked to people, all stakeholders, people experiencing them, people treating them. Yes, indeed, this is a problem worth solving. And because you were in the know, and because you had a friend in their lab, you found out about this technology actually in advance of their publication, and you managed to license it for use on wheelchairs. So you've licensed it, and after many months, you were able to adapt the technology so that you could put it or embed it on a wheelchair under the first layer of material, let's say. So you have a working prototype. Now what? So what I'd like to do is just either as a group or in our small groups, or in small groups, probably as a group, just go through this and say, okay, well, how we have a technology, we have a need, how are we going to implement this? Thought experiment. Good way to discuss the points here. So, anyone want to start? Stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Nobody knows any stakeholders.
Disabled people.
I would phrase it slightly differently, I think, because not all people who are challenged necessarily experience pressure sores. It depends on the kind of way you think about it. So perhaps another way of thinking about it is people who experience pressure sores. But a particular type as a result of being in wheelchairs. Okay, so those people are absolutely one stakeholder. Those, and who else do we think about if we had to do this sort of? Sharon, just jump in.
Yeah, I'm trying to be polite, but it's very hard for me to be polite because I'm not a polite person. Like wheelchair seat manufacturers, potentially, like people who are building wheelchair seat cushions, for example. That could be another group of people.
Yep, absolutely. Anyone else?
The healthcare providers prescribing the wheelchairs to the users.
Yeah, depending on where you are, depending on the country, depending on the health system, whether there's lack of subsidy or subsidy, who makes those decisions, all of those people would become stakeholders in the supply chain. So you're right, the person who's experiencing the sore may not be the person that actually decided on a particular model of wheelchair for that person, or decided on how much could be spent on a wheelchair for that person. So all of those people become your stakeholders. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, sorry, these windows. So what, number 2, so we know the problem, or do we? What's the problem?
Well, up to 90% of individuals living with a spinal cord injury, at least from my research, are likely to develop a pressure injury at some point in their lifetime. So prevention is a huge strategy that could be used to mitigate that.
Okay. So the problem is?
People are getting pressure injuries.
Yeah, what we're trying to change is that we want to prevent, because, so this is it may be a nuance here, but it's an important one, because you could say that we could treat pressure sores, and you could only think about all of your technology and your sales and structuring your company just to treat pressure sores or identify the pressure sores. But here we're trying to prevent them. And the way we're trying to prevent them is stop them from happening. If we wanted to treat them, that's probably another market entirely. And it's probably, and as horrible as this sounds, the people that are trying to treat the pressure sores may not be as interested in preventing them. Okay. So what is the solution that we're putting forward? What's our intervention? It's easy. So I should tell you a little bit about this. If you look this up online and just do a search for MIT and for this invention disclosed June 3rd. So this is a cloth that is AI driven. So there is artificial intelligence and sensors built right into it, so that it measures aspects of human physiology, and then based on how it is programmed, responds to them. So it's not necessarily that it could be solely for pressure sores. This is a machine learning driven fabric that can learn from who's wearing it and how it's being worn. Our license covers its application to wheelchairs. So our solution has been to embed this mesh actually a little bit bigger and a little bit sort of more robust, because we don't need it to be just covering the body like in the picture. We can have it under a layer of material to shift. So it can be a little bit different. That's why it took us months to develop. The value is that if we can make this seat cushion and back adapt to points of the body and learn from where the person is leaning and how they use their chair and how often and what times, you can actually have the artificial intelligence probably at this point built into the chair, adapt the surface to prevent pressure ulcers the second it detects raised temperature levels at particular areas. And the value is that for the cost of embedding this material, which may add $100 or $200 into the chair, we potentially can save thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars in treating, not to mention the pain and discomfort and just the horror of, anyway, there's a huge return here. All right. So what kind of team will we need for this?
We need those people with lived experience.
Yes, absolutely. From the very beginning, and sort of assumed that when we identified the problem and verified it and went out and asked them, absolutely. So we needed them long before this point. They should already be part of the team at some level, and depending on who they are and what they're doing. But they should, absolutely.
Designers and engineers?
If we're going to be, so this is, again, this is where the strategy starts coming in. Are we going to be making the chair ourselves? Or are we going to be sub-licensing our slight alteration of the previous patent so that it can be applied to chairs? And if we sub-license, do we just produce the material for them and get the wheelchair companies to do it? Or do we want to invest in making our own chair? So depending on that, depending on the choices here, if you are going to work with, let's say, the company that makes chairs, they might have in-house engineers and developers that they contribute to the project. And that's part of how you develop it. So you don't necessarily need to employ them. If, on the other hand, you are going to make the chair from scratch, which may be a very important way of doing it, if the sensors and the AI need specialized machinery or room that needs to be built into the chair, you might be better off to start building your own. So then you have to decide, okay, I do need an industrial engineer, I do need materials engineer, and I need a developer for the AI. Does that sort of make sense?
So even if we're sub-licensing it to other wheelchair manufacturers, we still have to make modifications to the original technology and patent. So we would still need some sort of engineering and designing background in the team.
Sure. Sorry. Okay. I think let's go to market. So go to market instead of solution. My apologies. I'll just change that. Okay, so what are we going to do? And we've sort of started talking a little bit about this. So we could sub-license, we could develop, we could manufacture. So there are different ways, depending on how we structure, that we can decide on how to go to market. With a device, quite honestly, it may be, depending on the nature of the device, it may be absolutely worth it to just let somebody else mass produce it and you license it out to a device manufacturer. They might be able to have economies of scale, depending on what it is, to produce it faster and distribute it easier than you could with a startup fledgling company. So all of these things will need to be considered when you're putting together your plan of how you go to market. Who is your market? So that's also the next step. Are you selling within North America? The US, Canada will have slightly different regulations where you're, depending on where you manufacture. Are you selling overseas? All of these things will need to be thought about and will need to actually be negotiated into a license because you're sub-licensing something. So it has to be spelled out up front. And your revenue will depend on those choices. However, whether you are making money off of a license, so imagine that a chair manufacturer has agreed to a license that they will pay you $100 per chair for this, and it costs you $50 to produce, so you're making $50, but your license with MIT says you will pay them 50% of what you make. So now you're making $25, but you're making $25 on 10,000 chairs. So maybe that's good because they're manufacturing, they're distributing. You are actually at this point not necessarily doing much of anything other than making sure that their licenses are properly counted and that you pay your MIT. So milestones also depend. Funding. Okay, how do we get funding? Let's be creative. There's a reason why. It was a personal joke for myself, actually. When I talked about funding, that the arrow pointed to apply. Apply for funding, depending on your stage. Grants, competitions, pitch offs, Praxis, incubators, accelerators. Many hospitals these days have funds related to innovation. They don't even have to be necessarily along the specific line of what you're doing, but some aspect of what you're doing could qualify you. And funding is early stages really important, but so is getting out and looking for funders. So as you start moving, and if you are able to sell products, you potentially have something that people might want. And so you will start looking at getting investors if you're making money at it.
Joseph, maybe, the other spin-off bonus that I'm thinking of for doing all these, like you're alluding to, pitch competitions and all these different events is, there's it's kind of like your networking is done for you. Like that's also sort of the biggest problem. You're like, you don't know who to talk to, but like these people want to participate in these particular initiatives, and it might not be those people, but they tell their friends, and it starts the ball rolling, maybe in that sort of softer way as well too.
Yep, that's one really important thing, and absolutely. The other thing that I've noticed is that the more you present your idea, the better you get at it, or the better you get at presenting. Even if your idea doesn't necessarily move forward this time, when you start presenting your next idea, you will be more comfortable and you will be further ahead based on what you've learned from this one. So even if you don't win the money, getting the feedback and the advice and the practice is incredibly important. Because what I've learned or witnessed over the last several years, it's also about stages. Quite often you don't win one stage, but if you keep trying, you eventually get to it. And then your next milestone is bigger. So now it becomes even more challenging. So as you move forward, each time you have a new bar to meet. So practice is really important, I think. Unless you're like one of these really, really lucky people that's set up a company and 6 months later exit for millions of dollars. All right. Are there any questions, comments? One of the things that I was thinking in preparing for this actually is that this should have been the first session. And we should have just worked it backwards. But maybe in the next round, we're going to have a redone, more workshop-y like curriculum, where maybe we do go through each of these stages with your ideas.
Yeah, sometimes you have to reverse engineer things. You start with taking something and then sort of break it down into smaller parts. And yeah, I don't know, maybe that's an open question for some of the crowd, is what their kind of preferences are, but.
So moving forward, we are still working on the Praxis Challenge Round 1. We will be issuing some very important, likely news in the next little bit about demo day. You guys can have a preview that what we're working on, it hasn't been officially 100% confirmed, but most likely we will be moving demo day to September 22nd. So if you have ideas you're working on or other things you can still think about applying, there's a little bit more time. We've been recommended that July is not ideal in terms of people and holiday time and the desire to build things. But also it gives a little bit more time for some special guests that we're looking into to come. And I'm very hopeful that if it works out, it's going to be amazing. So you are the first few that are aware of this. It was something that we will confirm, but is most likely, if not the demo day, then for sure that's when our new round will start. New and better round, 2.0. So stay tuned. And if you have any questions, I'm all ears. No comments, nothing? Well then, thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to chatting with you soon, and consider applying to the Ideation Clinic Praxis Innovation Challenge if you have any ideas.
Can I ask a question, Joseph? Like in terms of the prototyping day, like what is the structure of that? Is that like you just whoever applies, or you guys will pick, and then people will just like share their screen? Like, how does that work?
So thank you for asking. So what we're looking at, that's part of the thing, is that why we're really hoping that we can delay it, is because first of all, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. As you know, that even by September, it's unlikely that we'll be able to do full in-person engagements, but it hopefully was a little better. So it's going to be online. It's going to, we're going to have, of the demos that are proposed and applied, we will have a short list and judges will be able to vote in advance. The demos themselves will essentially be either videos or slides, digital content essentially, that will be posted on a site like, and probably VoiceThread, and integrated into our website. So you'll be able to see the demos and comment on them or ask questions about them and vote for them. The day of the demo, they'll be up during the day and people can vote for them at that point. And then at the end of the session, based on the selection and the judging, one of those demos will be sort of awarded some money for development. And more significantly, if depending on the stage of the demo, there is potential that you can enter into the Praxis Institute incubator. And again, they also provide some more funding. So, and if not Praxis, then there are the Hunter Hub, there's, in each of the schools, there are elements, H2I, that will potentially help out.
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, one thing I did forget, we will also have some people there that you can network with. So like Health Canada, hopefully some of the VCs and the incubators and accelerators, but also some companies that produce things and exhibitors. But we're going to try and do the demos as digital demos this time around. All right.
Excuse me, I missed the point. Is the demo a live session that we should describe and announce our idea, or no? It's a kind of written form. I think I missed this point. Excuse me.
During the demo days, when you display, it'll just be a digital artifact. So it can be a video, it can be a PowerPoint presentation of showing how your concept works, but you need to demonstrate what it is, who it's for, and what it does.
Joseph, sorry, I may have missed this, but when is the deadline to submit your video or?
I believe, well, if we move it, it'll probably be closer towards the end of August. That's part of what we're thinking. It's just not just for people that are the inventors who want to have Subsubber. There are those of us also who are not inventors that run things that also like to have maybe some time in the sun.
Okay.
So, and then school starts in September. So that's the whole beginning of September is a wash, whether it's for public school, universities, or whatever. It's going to be an interesting time. So that's why we're hoping that it's approved to move to the 22nd. Just to give a little more time, but also it'll be in the work year. Or school year. All right. there are no other questions, thank you for listening. Your patience is much appreciated. Can I, just before everyone goes, was the thing about the key evident? Did I, like, that it sort of made sense in those stages? Was that useful as a guide? You can say no.
Like the key is in like the overall framework that you showed and then not to the side.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was helpful. That was helpful for me personally.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that feedback. Much appreciated. And I'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.